This is a Film Stories original podcast.
This is Writers on Film, the only podcast dedicated to books on cinema. Hi everybody and welcome to Writers on Film. My name is John Bleasdale. I'm a writer and film critic, and today I'm delighted to be celebrating Noirvember by talking to an expert on noir films who's got a new book out, Through a Noir Lens, Adapting Film Noir Visual Style. Sheri Chinen Biesen is a professor on cinema, and she is the author of several books on noir, in fact. Thank you so much for joining me, Sheri.
Oh, my pleasure.
This wasn't planned to be specifically a Noirvember podcast, but I looked at the calendar and I thought, oh, there it is.
Excellent. Yes, it's wonderful.
This is only your latest book on noir, film noir. When did your fascination with this particular genre begin?
Decades ago, when I was a young undergrad student at the University of Southern California, USC Cinema School, and I was turned on to film noir. This was like in the 80s. And then I started serious noir research when I decided this is kind of a second career for me. I worked as a writer for several years. And then in the 90s, I decided to go back to cinema school and pursue becoming an author and an academic and professor. So I began my noir research back in the 90s, did a master's at USC Cinema, and then did my Ph.D., cinema. Basically, I'm a film historian, and I did my cinema degree at University of Texas at Austin. Did my dissertation, well, actually, I'm an archival historian, so I did a lot of primary archival research at many archives, including the BFI there in London, but also, most of my research is in LA-based Los Angeles archives like USC and the Academy of Motion Pictures and UCLA and so forth, where I look at the original records when filmmakers were making the films behind the scenes, the production memos and so forth. And I basically pieced together the history of when these films were actually made. So I've looked at the original documents, for Double Indemnity and The Big Sleep and Out of the Past and these, so forth, these very famous noir films, classic noir films. So I turned it into an academic paper that became an article that became kind of the cornerstone of my doctoral dissertation, which was on film noir, the wartime Hollywood filmmaking climate and its impact on the actual material conditions of making these noir films in the 40s in Hollywood. And then that became my first book, A Blackout, World War II and the Origins of Film Noir. And my second book was called Music in the Shadows. It was on noir musical films, looking at sort of jazz noir and this sort of the musical, aspect of noir films. And then my third book was on film censorship. And then this is very much an extension of my noir research. This last book, my fourth book, this is Through a Noir Lens, Adapting Film Noir Visual Style. So it basically takes a look at noir films with a lot of primary archival evidentiary support, sort of constructing, the making of the films and the sort of institutional and cultural and, actual material filmmaking conditions, when they were making these films. And it basically takes a look at noir from the 40s, from the end of World War II through, the post-war era and the neo-noir and the post-classical Renaissance era and more contemporary decades, and then the shift to digital streaming in the Netflix sort of, digital streaming era. And so it goes all the way through the COVID-19 pandemic, looking at sort of the legacy and the influence of classic noir films on, not only the original 40s nitrate era films shot on the actual nitrate film stock, but all the sort of technical and industrial changes. It's basically a technical and industrial history of the legacy, and evolution of noir visual style.
It's absolutely stunning book in terms of the breadth and scale of what you look at. And I found myself, I was really surprised that, you starting with, as you say, the 1940s, and then you're ending with things like Jessica Jones and you talk about HBO, Perry Mason, and it was just like some of those I'd never even considered in that same framework. So it was really interesting to have that sort of concept and to feel that the legacy of noir has been so influential.
Yes, absolutely. And thank you so much for the kind words. I really appreciate it.
I'm an absolute huge fan of noir. I've one of the, funnily enough, talking about the COVID years, I think I got. Noir was one of the first genres I really felt and claimed as my own as a cineast. That as a young cineast, as a kid.
Wonderful. Yes.
More than westerns were on TV and sci-fi it's good fun, but noir was the first film that I thought, this is a type of film. It's not just a type of story.
Yeah, absolutely.
Does that distinction make sense?
Yes, absolutely. And in my research, both in my doctoral thesis and then also, in my noir scholarship from my first book, Blackout, and through this one, through a noir lens, I actually look at the complexity and the nuances and the sort of how influential noir is as this sort of zeitgeist. I basically look at it as, of course, I'm looking at it as a visual style in this last book through a noir lens, but in general, in broad strokes, I actually investigate how noir is this period style, this very influential period style that's very prolific, right? It influences so many things down the road, and it actually influences and transforms many different genres. So you can have noir westerns and noir musicals and noir sci-fi like Blade Runner, right? Royce's Dark City and so forth. So I actually look at it beyond, the sort of typical conception of thinking of noir just as like a single genre, because you can see all these different types of films, even in the classic era in the 1940s, right? You've got these sort of noir female gothic films, and you've got these, noir hardboiled detective films, and you've got films like Double Indemnity, that it's such a definitive, influential, important noir film, but it's not a classic sort of hard-boiled detective, but it's very hard-boiled, and you have, the Edward G. Robinson, Barton Keyes character in there, and he's functioning as an investigative sort of, he's a claims investigator, and so you have this sort of narrative detective framework. And it's also, you have films that are mysteries, and then something like Double Indemnity is not a murder, it's a murder film, but it's a crime film, but it's not a mystery film, right? They're revealing, the anti-hero, Walter Neffy's revealing that he did it right up front, right? And so it's very, very interesting that you've got all these different types of films, including these jazz noir musical films like Blues in the Night, that are very, very interesting, even in the 40s. And then the influence, by the time you get into the 50s and they're shifting to different kinds of film, they're shifting to color, and in the neo-noir era, in the post-classical Hollywood. And of course, even the international films, right? Like Elevator to the Gallows and so forth, right? You've got these really interesting variations on noir and noir style and even the type of narratives, right, that we think of as film noir. So yeah, it's really fascinating. It's wonderful to talk to someone who's also passionate about noir.
I was really struck in the book by some of the examples you used, which, like, for instance, you were talking about the female Gothic there, and you talk about Jane Eyre as being an example of that.
Notorious, yes.
And Notorious, yes, of course. And it's like, Jane Eyre, you sort of think, surely that's not a film noir. And then you think about it again, and it's like, well, actually, yeah, it's got Bertha Mason in the attic, and it's absolutely, even from a narrative point of view, it's plenty noir.
Well, the visual style is so noir, and this book is very, heavily leaning into, analyzing the formal aesthetic, stylistic tropes and qualities of film noir, right? So something like that. I mean, during the war years, when films such as Jane Eyre and Double Indemnity were being filmed, you actually had, because of all the wartime sort of tensions and paranoia and the restrictive filmmaking climate during World War II, as I discuss in my first book, Blackout, and also in this book, you had these, you had actual blackouts in Hollywood and air raid drills and all these restrictions. You had rationing of lighting and electricity and set materials, and you couldn't film on certain locations. So there were a lot of actual material filmmaking conditions during World War II that contributed to this really dark, brooding, expressionistic look and feel and zeitgeist, if you will, of film noir. And you get it in Jane Eyre. Jane Eyre is so dark visually, and it's all shot on these enclosed 20th Century Fox sound stages. It's these nighttime, these beautiful, gorgeous nighttime sets with all this dark blackened shadows and this, you've got these fog machines with this, swirling, dense, banks of fog and so forth, and the brooding dark Gothic mansion, right? And Wells is just so fabulous, right, as the Noir anti-hero, moody and tormented and very dark, right? And you've got all these really very, provocative, disturbing gender polemics going on, right? With the crazy wife, entrapped in the bowels of the castle, right? It's like it's got all these dark things in it, and it's very, very interesting how the gender distress that you see in these Gothics, right? And like you have, I'm talking narratively at the moment, in the same way that you have narratively the sort of femme fatale and the hard-boiled, tormented anti-hero, sometimes a detective, right, and sort of more hard-boiled noir films with maybe a dangerous, lethal, sexualized femme fatale. Or maybe a sideline good girl redeemer too. Maybe you have that, right? But in the same sort of sense, some of these things are sort of that binary is kind of reversed, but also related in something like the noir female Gothic films of Wells and Hitchcock and so forth, because you've got the homme fatale instead of a femme fatale. You've got the older, mysterious, potentially deadly or dangerous lover or husband. You've got, so there's an homme fatale there, and you've got the young, more naive ingenue, right? Who usually survives by the end of the film, but sometimes, but she may think that they're trying to kill her, right? And there's all these, I've done a lot of work on Gothics too, and I'm working on another project, so I'll probably have more research coming out in that terrain in the future. But I'm just coming off of this book. There was a lot of the gender and the Gothic stuff that got cut that sort of moved into another project. So we'll see if I get the energy after finish that one next. But
definitely, I can see how there is an overlap as well. But I want, for our listeners who may be less versed in noir, there's two questions that I want to have. First of all is, can we sort of give a kind of broad strokes definition of both the visual and the narrative aspects of noir, and then a little bit of a sense of the history as well. When are we starting off with that first classic period?
Noir is a very interesting concept, right? It's the term film noir was coined in 1946 by French critics. But noir really began to proliferate in the 40s during the war years, during the early to mid 40s in Hollywood. You had the influence of many expressionistic European emigres who had fled fascism in Europe and so forth and were in Hollywood. And noir really, you have the influence of, the earlier, the European German expressionism, expressionistic horror films and so forth, early crime, gangster films and so forth, right? Like the early 30s gangster cycle and so forth. But noir really coalesces and comes together. Early sort of prelude noir films, by 1940, 41. But, and then in this early 40s during the war years, noir really coalesces and you really see really definitive very black and shadowy expressionistic noir style, say 44 to 46, but definitely in the 40s, noir bursts onto the scene in a big way. Noir is noted for its dark, nighttime, often sort of urban settings, oftentimes. The sort of, the American urban jungle, right? These shadowy, blackened, rain-slick city streets, lots of glistening surfaces and shadows, deep shadows, very brooding, corrupt narratives, You have a variety of narratives of noir. People think about the hard-boiled detective, also the female gothic. People think about the tormented, sometimes psychologically unstable anti-hero in noir. And you have different types of gender that, comes out in more different types of women as well as with the anti-hero, right? You have, the strong, independent, sexual, devious, duplicitous, potentially, deadly femme fatale, seductress oftentimes. Scholars have looked at this as a projection of sort of male sexual fears and desires, right, projected on the big screen. You may also have, in terms of gender, the good girl or Good Friday, the sort of the redeemer character. That's not the toxic fatal attraction type of romance, but sort of more on the sidelines. And I'm fascinated by other films that have more complex sort of gender, constructs in the noir films, such as films like Gilda and Phantom Lady, where you've got these more complex, multifaceted women in them. They may come off as they may masquerade or pretend to be femme fatales when they're actually working girls, more androgynous, or good girl redeemers, right? So you have these sort of more multifaceted images of women in the war years, and this coincides with the sort of war effort and strong, androgynous Rosie the Riveter women in American culture, in the Allied culture, working to fill in male roles, male jobs, as men were going off to fight in World War II. And even in Hollywood, like the culture in general, you had women gaining positions behind the scenes as well as in star roles more prominently during World War II, because there was a manpower shortage in Hollywood during the war. And you had, women writers and producers, such as Joan Harrison, who was a protege of Hitchcock, who produced Phantom Lady, and Virginia Van Up, who rose from a writer to a producer to one of the most powerful women in Hollywood during this time, a production executive running Columbia Studio under Harry Cohn, from January 45 through 47. And so she produced Gilda, and you have these, women behind the scenes that were coinciding with stronger gender roles in these noir films, in the films that they were, writing and producing, for example. Famously Ida Lupito, who would move from becoming a star to, a director in the post-war years in noir films. So, yes, so very shadowy, dark, brooding milieu, environment, visual, terrain in these noir films. You probably have, they had the height of noir productions and the popularity of noir really, the classic cycle, really towards the end of World War, right? 44, 45, 46, and then into those early war years, 47, 48. And then things start to change with noir, but noir itself starts to change. You have more, I mentioned earlier that you had these very enclosed, dark, shadowy noir productions, responding to the wartime production restraints and the blackouts during World War II and the rationing of electricity and so forth. And then after the war, you start to see noir being lighter. They moved from what was called newsreel style during World War II to a type of cinematography that was called sort of semi-documentary style, and more shooting outdoors in broad daylight and sunlight, bright sunlight on outdoor locations, and sometimes, outside the urban centers. And then by the time you get to the 1950s, the narratives, of course, are changing, and the film stock itself is changing. The nitrate stock was really gorgeous and really beautiful for film noir. The blacks were jet black, which was really iconic of film noir, and the whites were this sort of harsh, nice sharp contrast with the white, sort of for that contrast with your noir shadows and so forth, right? You think of the visual iconography of film noir. You think of not just the fedoras and the hard-boiled anti-heroes, but you think of the Venetian blind shadows and the dark alleys and these, deep blackened pools of shadow and light.
Rain-wet streets and,
exactly.
cigarette smoke.
Yes, just beautiful. It's gorgeous. That's the kind of milieu, the visual style that I love.
I'd never thought of this, but that was something. Another sort of revelation from your book is thinking about film stock in terms of thinking about those aesthetic possibilities and that idea that, look, this nitrate is perfect for this aesthetic. And then some of the films that we think of as noir, classic noirs, I think you talk about Double Indemnity in this way, are actually using another film stock, and you talk about them as almost being like grey noirs.
Oh yeah, well, Double Indemnity is not a grey noir. Double Indemnity was a great blackened sort of expressionistic noir films. That's really jet black. That was shot on nitrate. And I should also note, I mentioned that the term film noir was coined in 1946 overseas in France. Well, these began as very much wartime films. But of course, because of World War II, international distribution was interrupted between 1940 and 1946, right? In Paris, for example, right? So, they had, you had films in the UK, for example, but in Europe and parts of Europe, right, where the conflict was ensuing, right, you had, suddenly in 1946, French critics were seeing these noir films produced in Hollywood between 1940 and 1946, and they were seeing them all at once in one fell swoop, right?
Of course, yeah.
Yeah, they're like, wow, look at this dark, film noir is literally black film or dark cinema, right? So they're like, wow, look at how dark these films are coming out of Hollywood. And I should also note that in my archival research, I was really surprised to find that this trend was recognized in Hollywood and in the American press and the trade discourse and so forth before 1946 in the U.S. And it wasn't called film noir, but they referred to this as the red meat crime cycle or red meat crime and romance cycle. So it was recognized as a sort of groundbreaking trend, and that Billy Wilder's Double Indemnity was really influential and sort of spurring this bandwagon mentality of studios producing noir films and sort of getting around the production code censorship at the time, adapting the hard-boiled fiction like James M. Cain and Raymond Chandler, right? And so, this was seen as this very vanguard sort of cutting-edge trend of films. But yeah, these early noir films in the 40s, they were shot on nitrate. And then in 1950, actually, you think of famous, beautiful 1950 noir films. Of course, Sunset Boulevard is one of them, and that film was also Billy Wilder, right, directing it. But it's a little lighter than Double Indemnity, but it's one of the last major feature films shot on nitrate film stock. And after that, from 1951 onward, you have them shooting on acetate film stock. And the reason that they did that was, of course, because nitrate looked beautiful, was gorgeous for the look of noir. But of course, it was highly unstable and volatile, and it was very explosive and flammable. And it would, over time, it would sort of, disintegrate and turn to dust. And of course, it was so volatile that during World War II, they were rationing film stock, the nitrate film stock, to use it to make bombs because it was so explosive. So, for safety reasons, they switched to safety film from 1951 onward. But that changes the whole look of noir film style, in addition to the shooting in sunlight and outdoor locations. And a great example of that is, of course, Billy Wilder's Ace in the Hole, which is his last noir film. It was not successful at the box office. But this is a film that's shot in scorching, bright sunlight, in the more rural desert of New Mexico. It's a very, very bright noir film, although thematically it's very scathing and very cynical. But Ace in the Hole looks so different than Double Indemnity, or even Sunset Boulevard the year before, and that's shot on acetate film, out with these big reflectors in the sunshine and the desert. And they have some, they have some dark scenes in the cave, right? But it's, they're outdoors, and it kind of looks like film blanc or something. It's like the antithesis. Thank you. It's very, very different, although it's narratively very, very dark and disturbing and brooding.
Yeah, it's one of the darkest films I've ever seen from that point of view. I mean, you mentioned in the book that everybody in this film is kind of rotten, even the sort of victim of the situation isn't without fault. It's truly a truly disturbing film and excellent. I think it's one of Billy Wilder's maybe lesser known films at the moment, and it really deserves to be right up there with his best films.
Yes, it's fabulous, and including that amazing final shot, right, where self-destructive, corrupt anti-hero played by Kirk Douglas, he just falls right. They've got that camera really low. They've got that camera right on the floor, and then his character just falls, dead with his face right there, and the camera at the end, and it's sort of, it's to the end of. I mean, it's really, almost a metaphoric sort of iconic image of the end of a certain era in Hollywood and the end of a certain classic noir style, the end of Billy Wilder's noir films, because the film was not successful, and he shifted to making comedies and musicals and so forth. But yeah, I mean, Wilder is such an influential figure, and that is an amazing noir film.
I also think of, you've got so many great directors working in this milieu, John Huston, Stanley Kubrick makes a couple of noir films, and even, I think you mentioned sort of Dr. Strangelove and Lolita are to some extent influenced by the noir sort of visual.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And there's The Killers, there's excuse me, not The Killers, The Killing, which is quite interesting. But and Hitchcock, Hitchcock is directing, this sort of female gothic espionage noir hybrid with something like Notorious, right? He's also directing Spellbound, and those are fabulous films. And then of course, in the 50s, not only is Hollywood shifting to nitrate, but they're shifting to color. And even the color technology is changing from the gorgeous, 3-strip Technicolor that they had, in the 30s and 40s, and the early 50s, to, Hollywood is trying to compete with television with these big widescreen color spectacles, right? And the color technology becomes more affordable for studios because Technicolor, opens up its technology so that other companies such as Eastman Kodak can make this sort of cheaper single strip, Eastman Color monopack film stock. It didn't look quite as good as 3-strip Technicolor, but Technicolor also allowed studios to develop the film in the Technicolor, what they called the dye transfer imbibition, or IB, developing process, which sort of emulated the look, superior quality color of the 3-strip Technicolor process derived from a single strip of film. So they could sort of emulate that in the developing process. And so you had what I call the color noir style shift from films like in the 40s, the gorgeous color noir style of The Red Shoes, with the Archers, Michael Powell and Emmerich Pressburger, that had stunning, gorgeous color noir visual style, very much influenced by the noir aesthetic in color, and shot in 3-strip Technicolor, even on location in the Mediterranean, the south of France, and so forth. And then you had other color 3-strip Technicolor noir films, such as Niagara with Marilyn Monroe, such as The Barefoot Contessa. And then you have these gorgeous color noir films, in widescreen that were shot in Eastman Kodak monopack stock and oftentimes developed in Technicolor, such as Hitchcock's Rear Window, North by Northwest, such as George Cukor's A Star is Born with Judy Garland and James Mason. Incredible performance by James Mason in that film. And so many other films, including, noir musicals. So not only A Star is Born, but something like West Side Story, which is really very much influenced by these earlier sort of noir and color noir traditions and aesthetics that you see. So I find that really fascinating, all this sort of technological industrial changes and stylistic changes in the noir look and feel and style by the time you get to the 1950s.
West Side Story I'd never thought of as a noir film, and then when you say, oh wait a second, but Bernstein did the score for On the Waterfront as well, and
yes.
And you start thinking of, wait a second, West Side Story, you start remembering, there's all the fire escapes and there's the land between the buildings, which the guys, and it's like, yeah, God, it's all there, isn't it? It's all alleyways and,
Yes. And I interviewed Robert Wise years ago, and he referred to it as a noir musical. And of course, Wise had been directing noir films, right? He'd been doing these earlier, 40s films or even films like The Setup, right? And of course, he edited Citizen Kane, right? So, he had worked on noir films, he directed noir films, and it was his first musical. It's not as bright and out on location as, say, Sound of Music later.
Yeah, Sound of Music is not a noir musical.
It's not a noir, no. There are Nazis, but it's not a noir.
I mean, it's important to say, where there's definitions have to be.
That's right.
Have to have their negatives.
That's right. Yeah, no. I mean, he talked about how, he really wanted to film the opening of West Side Story on location in Manhattan, and they did that, right? But then he made the deal. He said, "Look, if you let me film the opening on location, then I can shoot the rest of the film in the studio, because most of it occurs at night." And he says, at night you see what you light, and that's very noir, right? And that's exactly when you think of the rumble under the freeway overpass, right? And the crisscrossing sort of entrapment of the young juvenile delinquents, like caged in fences and all the shadows and in color noir you have this aesthetic where using color you emulate the look and style of film noir, not only with shadows but with the hues, the different choice of the color palette that you use. So you might use dark colors to emulate blacks and sort of muted tones, maybe browns and grays or midnight blues, to sort of emulate the look of black and white. And if there's a dominant color, you may have splashes of red or scarlet red that sort of to suggest and signify, danger or blood or caution or love, death, and you see that in these films, whether it's in these color films, whether it's West Side Story or A Star is Born or Rear Window, even the scarlet dress that Hitchcock has Eva Marie Saint wear in North by Northwest, right? So you've got it, and of course Marilyn Monroe as a seductress in Niagara, And Niagara is interesting because you've got the outdoor location in Technicolor of Niagara Falls, but then you've got these very dark, shrouded, enclosed. She dies. She's murdered, and you've got these overhead shots and with the deep shadows and the bars of entrapment and everything. In that film as well. So it's very interesting.
Yeah, I love that the section on Rear Window and how this artificial environment of complete control has been created, and it is sort of like a metaphor almost of what noir is doing entirely, because it's all happening in this box called the studio.
Yes, I mean, like Jane Eyre, was shot entirely on these enclosed sound stages, a decade earlier, right? What Hitchcock's doing in Rear Window is so interesting. Originally he thought about shooting it on location in Greenwich Village in New York City. But he didn't, he had some of his photographers go out and shoot some test footage. And he didn't like, the look of the lighting and the color and the image quality. He didn't like, what he saw. And so he famously sort of emulated the look of Greenwich Village in New York City entirely on a soundstage, a huge set on a soundstage, one of the biggest at the time that had ever been built. And it was amazing. It's amazing when you watch it. It was such an elaborate set. They had to dig a floor into the basement, and they had sets going up 5 stories into the rafter. The lights were very, very hot for the actors. They had individual apartments in the building, the set of a building, and each apartment was individually lit. So they had individual lighting setups and characters and inhabitants in each apartment. This sort of voyeuristic point of view from Jimmy Stewart's window as Jeffries, the photographer, and of course it was so elaborate that they had pre-lit the sets. So at the flip of a switch, you could make it nighttime or dawn or dusk or afternoon, based on the time of day, based on the sort of pre-lit lighting setups that they had. But yeah, Hitchcock is very much emulating the shadowy, enclosed, dangerous look of, deadly milieu of film noir entirely on an enclosed soundstage, and in this case, shot in widescreen in color. They shot it in Kodak Eastman color and developed it in Technicolor to get that better, richer color aesthetic, from using the Technicolor process when they developed it. And you have this sort of, the murder takes place as Jimmy Stewart is dozing off in this rain, this dark, nighttime thunderstorm in the middle of the night, and you hear the very brief, piercing sort of brief shriek as the murder occurs, but it's off screen, and he's unaware of it, but the audience hears it. And the rain is pouring down, and you see the sort of neon light from the cafe across the street through the dark alley, the narrow alley, the apartment building. The rain's coming down, and then Raymond Burr as the murderer, right? He's Thorwald. He's going in and out with his knives and his suitcases, disposing of the body in the middle of the night, right, in the rain. So it's very creepy and brooding and very, very film noir. I also love in that film that Grace Kelly, Hitchcock, decided he wanted to showcase for Grace Kelly, and he wanted to add these strong women characters. And so Grace Kelly's character, Lisa Fremont, is just fabulous. She's gorgeous, and she's strong. She's independent. She's a career woman. Yeah. And of course, Thelma Ritter, it's not, you often have the kind of Hitchcock mama's boy, or as well as the Hitchcock blonde in his films. And there's not a mother in Rear Window, but she's this very maternal nurse that's coming in with Jimmy Stewart, and she's so hard-boiled and wisecracking and hilarious. I mean, Thelma Ritter's fabulous, right? And so I just really love the gender polemics, that as well.
Because they make up a team which sort of counterbalances the obvious sort of misogyny of the murderer, and even the sort of voyeurism where you're talking about Miss Torso in the other room. Yes. He's cutting up a torso. So
yes, exactly. And Thelma Ritter is sort of vocalizing this very morbid, dark comedy, this commentary on the murder. Yeah, and it's so misogynistic, right? That this guy's, knocking off his wife and disposing of her, right? And the voyeurism of his torso. And Grace Kelly's sort of knowing commentary as a society woman, right? As she's not interested, she's not in love with anything. So the sort of provocative gender polemics are quite interesting, but I like that there's got a hard-boiled element and a lot of dark comedy in that film as well as the disturbing gender distress.
You mentioned earlier about how studios were beginning to compete with television, producing widescreen spectacle as well as, but also as you go on, you talk in the book, the films make us start to be aware that actually some of their films are going to end up on television, these small, and so they're going to have to be medium shots, they're going to have to be well lit, because otherwise you just won't be able, which is hilarious, because it's similar to the sort of criticism Netflix sometimes gets, because it's like, I'm watching this on my iPad and I can't see what's going on, and we've gone backwards in a way. Is that a moment where that seems to be a moment where sort of noir dips out for a decade or two?
Thank you for honing in on that. I early on, as early as the late 40s, as particularly after 1948, you see early television starting to become popular. After 1948, but especially 1950s. And as early as the late 40s, you already have cinematographers in Hollywood talking about, shooting Hollywood films, with televisual conventions in mind, with television in mind. And because television at this time was this, grainy, fuzzy, low resolution, low contrast, small screen, monochrome, black and white TV, although it was free in American homes, it wasn't, the image quality wasn't great. And they couldn't do most of the beautiful aspects of noir style that we think of as iconic noir style, whether it's beautiful, expressionistic, low-key lighting, high contrast cinematography, beautiful, elaborate montages, and so forth. A lot of these, the cinematographers would refer to them as sort of, art shots or whatever, right? This was iconic of the noir visual style. And as television became more popular, in the 1950s, Hollywood started adopting, particularly in the black and white films, mind you. The black and white noir films, you can think of them stylistically in terms of sort of film gris, sort of gray films rather than film noir, black films, because they really do lighten up, and they really, the shooting is much less elaborate and much less shadowy and expressionistic. And it's not even on nitrate stock anymore, right? It's just the whole look and feel and style of noir changes in the 1950s. And from a certain point of view, it's almost stylistically, you can almost think of it as sort of the death of the original expressionistic, blackened film noir style that you see in the 40s, particularly in the war years, right? But noir adapts, and it adopts, newer conventions. And as the black and white 1950s noir films are sort of ebbing and declining, or the classic noir cycle eventually declines in the 1950s, particularly after all of these conventions undermine the original look and feel of the noir, the 40s, the black noir style that we see in the original cycle. Not only do you get that with the black and white films during this period, but at the same time, as Hollywood is moving to more color films and widescreen to compete with small screen black and white television at the time, Hollywood decided with the color film production to try to draw audiences back into theaters. So the use of widescreen, large frame, CinemaScope, Cinerama, right, Panavision, and so forth, these different types of widescreen technologies, the use of these huge color spectacular images, right? Stereophonic sound. There was even the use of 3D smell-o-vision, these gimmicks that faded away later. And this was, and by the way, also very bold, provocative content that would have been censored on early television at the time. And so you see that in Rear Window, you see that in Stars Born and North by Northwest and West Side Story. You see, and even, before Hollywood shifts to widescreen, you see it in Technicolor noir films such as Niagara and The Barefoot Contessa, right? So you see, and of course, earlier in the 40s, the color noir, The Red Shoes. That was, by the way, I should mention, The Red Shoes, although it was a British film, was very, very influential in Hollywood. So much so that it came out in 1948. It was so influential that by the early 50s, it would become the most successful British film ever released in the US. And it was incredibly influential in Hollywood in terms of, the color noir aesthetic, the incorporation of music, right? Talk about that film. I mentioned that film in this last book. I also discuss it extensively in my second book on sort of this noir musicals, right? And this color noir. So it's very, very interesting how noir is so influential. And you would think, oh, maybe it's going to die in the 50s, but no, it continues, in these different forms, adapted. It's color noir, widescreen. And then, of course, after the end of the classical Hollywood era, by the time you get into, say, the late 60s and the 70s and onward, 80s, 90s, new millennium, you see different variations on noir and the legacy of noir in these sort of post-classical, neo-noir productions, both in the U.S. and overseas. Right? So very, 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 very interesting how adaptable the noir visual style and the legacy of it is,
Absolutely. I was thinking, there's pictures of it in your book, Jean-Pierre Melville, Le Samurai.
Yes.
And then you have Gene Hackman in both The Conversation and Night Moves, I think would be key sort of neo-noir. Coming up to the present day, and we've, even before the present day, you talk about one technical change, which I thought was really interesting as well, and with David Fincher with Seven, where there's a bleaching process that they start to use. I think it's an acronym beginning with E, if I remember correctly. Is that right?
Well, you had it even, they would use it in the neo-noir period, right? Including film and other films. But you even had it earlier in films such as Sunset Boulevard, right? That they would have not only bleaching, but the sort of what they would call it latensification, sort of where they would expose the film to light, sort of in addition to the regular developing process. And of course, by the time you get to the neo-noir period, they were doing it initially filmically and then eventually digitally, right? You could manipulate the image. By the time you get to something like Alex Proyas's Dark City in 1998, right? And even in films that we don't think about in relation to noir, such as Spielberg's, Saving Private Ryan, right? You had by the 90s, you had this manipulation of the image, and there was this sort of this synergy, this combination of shooting on film with digitally manipulating the image. Right? And so what you were thinking of with the acronym is the ENR process. And so you would get certain things that you could do digitally with these different processes, right? To manipulate, you could make a digital image look more filmic, right? You could darken the image, you could change the contrast, you could change the coloring of it by the time you get into the digital era. But even in the sort of early, if folks have seen Alex Proyas's amazing 1998 Dark City, that's just a gorgeous, beautiful film. And they shot that all on enclosed studios and Fox sound stages in Australia. And it was very influential. And, they were shooting on film, but they were using, burgeoning digital technology to, tweak the image, right, and adjust what you were seeing. Originally, in the earlier form of latensification, where they were exposing the film, the shot footage to light, additional light, they were doing it in films such as Sunset Boulevard to provide light to see into the shadows. So they shot indoor interiors on soundstage, and then they would shoot exteriors on this mansion, on location. And so they were trying to shoot with as much what looked like natural lighting as possible. So say they were shooting with a lamp in interiors or something, and they would have additional lights, but they were trying to make it look as naturalistic as possible. And so sometimes if they wanted to see into the shadows, they would do something like that. And what was really interesting to me as by the time you got to the digital streaming era, you had cinematographers working on Netflix productions, be it Jessica Jones or Daredevil or Ozark, right? As well as HBO productions such as Perry Mason. And the cinematographers were talking about using some of these techniques to try to either darken your image or to see into the shadows, right? Or when you get to the streaming era and you have these long form noir serial productions, oftentimes you would see this trend where the early seasons, the first season might be really dark and blackened and very beautifully noir looking. And then the studio or somebody might say, oh, you know what, we want to have it lighter in the second season or in later seasons. And so sometimes you would see the series lighten up as they would go on, right? And oftentimes it was really fascinating to me that the film critics loved noir style and sort of later neo-noir digital productions, but sometimes the TV critics, were sort of, couldn't fathom why you had these dark, shadowy, cinematic style. And of course, in the neo-noir era, cinematographers such as the great Gordon Willis, who shot, Francis Ford Coppola's The Godfather and Godfather Part 2, was very influential. And he talks about, The Godfather Part 2 being the last film shot, with the Technicolor dye transfer imbibition IB process in the US because they closed the Technicolor lab. And so in the digital era, you even have TV critics complaining that, oh, these long form noir productions, they're so dark, they're too dark, and they look too cinematic, and they look too much like, like they're just influenced by Gordon Willis. And I laughed. I thought that was hysterical. I was like, well, this is why they're so good.
They're influenced by the best cinematographer who's worked. And so
exactly.
That is nuts, but at the same time, it's kind of maybe the difference between sitting in a theater where you get your night vision, you get you're away from all light pollution, rather than sort of
immersive experience. Yes,
exactly.
Yeah.
But I wanted to ask a question about, and this is a technical question about a very specific film. So, by all means, it's and it's not one that's featured in your book. So, at least I don't think it is. Maybe it is actually. But anyway, Jonathan Glazer's Zone of Interest recently makes a real point of the darkness. It's part of the publicity. It's part of the actual the film. There are several moments in the film in which the screen goes black or characters look into darkness. And I was rewatching it last night, and because I'd been reading your book, I was thinking about the technical process by which they could have done this. Because at certain points, the screen wasn't just black. Like I'm looking at a screen now, and it's got a black border, which is hypothetically black, but it's sort of a glowing greenish, whitish black. It's not really black. But when I was watching Zone of Interest last night, at certain points where the screen went black, it's like someone had turned the screen off. It was like there was no light emanating from the screen at all. Is that something that like a director might choose to do? Is just let's put some frames of black in there. Let's just almost be like you're turning the projector off.
Yeah, I mean, you see it in other films as well. Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
The other thing that I think is really interesting is even in films that we don't typically think of as noir, or even maybe long form series that we don't typically think of as noir, you would have this technique of making things so dark. I mean, in terms of Netflix, digital streaming era noirs, I mean, Ozark is amazing in that way. Right. When you're Ozark, and they originally they talk about using a certain camera, and then switching to a different camera. I think at one point they were using a Panasonic camera, and then they were changing to a Sony camera because in one season they wanted this really jet black darkness that was just as you described. It was pitch black. And then they wanted something a little lighter to see into the shadows, so they switched cameras and enabled them to do that. But in other series such as Game of Thrones, right, there was all this hubbub about how dark these episodes were, and it was the same kind of thing. But what I find really interesting is even in feature films that we don't typically think of as film noir, you have this beautiful noir aesthetic. I mean, such as Darkest Hour is amazing. with and it's this it's they actually shot that digitally. It was shot on a digital camera using techniques to make it look more filmic, and it looks beautifully cinematic, but it's beautifully noir with that shimmering contrast and the sort of emphasizing the sort of color variation on black and white, emulating the look of a black and white film and emulating the look of a black and white noir film, as you were describing, right, with the pitch black, right? And this was, done digitally. So it's amazing, the techniques and the capabilities, I mean, there are some things that are shot where you look at it and you're like, oh, it just looks so digital. It doesn't really look noir at all. Right. But you have other things that are shot entirely on digital that are intentionally emulating the look of the cinematic, brooding, shadowy, blackened, mise-en-scène, that look of film noir. And I find that really interesting, really fascinating.
That's amazing. I'd like to, because we're coming to the end of today's show, I'd like to ask you if you could recommend for our listeners who might not, obviously your own books come highly recommended, but a book that you would like, you would recommend that either you found in your own work or would be a good introduction to noir for some of our listeners who might be wanting to read further.
On film noir, well, this, my last book, Through a Noir Lens, Adapting Film Noir Visual Style, is an extension of my first book, which sort of lays out the origins of film noir and explains that. So they might want to also take a look at Blackout, World War II, and the origins of film noir. If they're interested in reading about some of the original French discourse on film noir, you can actually find the very first book published on film noir was published in 1955, called Borde and Chomatin's Panorama du Film Noir Americain, or Panorama of American Film Noir. And this has been translated into English, and as well as the original French edition. And so that's quite an interesting book. It's a bit more psychoanalytic than these books. And there's all kinds of books on film noir that folks could find quite interesting, including, there's even more intro books that may not even be on film noir, but are very interesting on American cinema, that also talk about some of the early instances of noir. And these are sort of, historic books that have also been used as textbooks, such as the late great Robert Sklar's Movie Made America. And his work was very influential on mine when I was starting out in talking about the war, because, for years, scholars thought about film noir as this post-war trend, and I was really fascinated by what was going on before the term film noir was coined in 1946. And so, Sklar was examining, cultural, institutional history of American films, of Hollywood, and looking at these wartime noir films and how, influential they were, and how, the impact of the war on that. There are also great intro books that have been used as textbooks. Thomas Schatz's work, who I worked with in my doctoral research, he was very influential to me, my work. He has an early book on Hollywood genres, which talks about film noir, but more in terms of the hardboiled detective. But in his 1940s book, most people know of his work, The Genius of the System, but his book, Boom and Bust, American Cinema in the 1940s, he was finishing that as I was working with him. And it's an excellent book. It's more of a reference book. It was fabulous. And he talks about the female Gothic and the hard-boiled variation on that. And so Robert Sklar and Thomas Schatz are very, very influential to my work and my thinking of American cinema and film noir. But I could go on and on. I worked.
You've given us a great list there. I think there's a lot of names there for people to get their teeth into, and but obviously I would recommend that they begin with Through a Noir. Oh no, maybe even begin with Blackout, and then go to Through a Noir.
Yes, absolutely. It's sort of a follow-up, sort of a sequel. For years, people, Blackout was a very influential film. Influential Noir book on film,
Sure.
and sort of changed. I was surprised by the research that I uncovered in the archives, and I was surprised to see the extent to which the war was influential on film noir. And for years, people were saying, "Oh, why don't you write a sequel to Blackout?" And I was so burned out; it just took a long time to get around to it. And then, and by the time I started working on Through a Noir Lens a few years ago, I had been doing a lot of work on Netflix and the digital streaming era, and these sort of new digital sort of noir styled, productions that were I saw as heavily influenced by the classic noir cycle. And so I decided, in following up Blackout, that I wanted to pick up the threads from the 40s and Blackout and the end of the war years, through the post-war neo-noir and the digital streaming era. And I was also, during the COVID era, I was really, I was surprised by, the noir productions that you see coming out of, studios and streamers like Netflix, whether it's Del Toro's, remake of Nightmare Alley, which was, I thought, fabulous.
Superb film.
Fabulous. I just loved it, both in color and in black and white, right? And a black and white version too, which was gorgeous. Even Netflix remaking a digital film version of Hitchcock's Rebecca, right, which had a different sort of zeitgeist going on, more of a color noir thing, with the visual style and that. So that was really interesting. And if I recall, I believe both of those films were shot digitally, but they intentionally strive to emulate the look of filmic, cinematic, classic noir style, in films like that. And so that was really interesting.
Well, that sounds like the best way for us to round off this discussion, and for us to celebrate Noirvember. And I know there are a lot of people out there who are looking at letterboxed lists of films to watch, and I hope you're going to do a more informed deep dive into noir, because it's such a wonderful genre. Thank you so much, Sheri. I really enjoyed our conversation. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you. My pleasure. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.